right, welcome back. Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Red Line.
Welcome, a podcast designed to illuminate maneuvering a broken healthcare system as a patron, patient, and provider. Restricted access does not mean restricted resources. This is a new audiovisual podcast. You can find BTRL on all of the process platforms. And I'm your host, Rebecca Peplau, and please help me welcome my lovely co-host, Alessandra Nicholson.
Thank you so much. Thank you for returning for episode 2 of Behind the Red Line, where we explore practical tools for radical accountability, respect, and healing at the intersections of health, wealth, race, class, and gender. On episode 1, we examined burnout, and one of the outcomes of prolonged burnout can be people showing up as apathetic or defensive or detached. And when we're working together, this behavior, conscious or unconscious, can be negatively impactful on work relationships and desirable outcomes. So today we're going to take a look at the ego and how it shapes the personality and a few tips on managing our egos at work. At times, we use the terms personality and ego interchangeably. So we're going to break down what is the ego and what is personality.
So your ego is the mental manager that weighs desires against conscious and decides what will or will not be done. Your ego is your conscious mind. It is the part of your identity that you consider yourself, that you identify with. It's going to work in conjunction with the other parts of your personality called the id and the superego. And so there is a graphic that we are going to share with you guys. It's based off of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, based on the 3 parts of the personality. So at the top of the iceberg, you have what's in your conscious level, and that is you only see part of the ego. So part of yourself is really shining through. When it goes down a notch to the pre-conscious level, you see the superego. Now, the superego is the conscious evaluator of social consequences, of courses of action. It serves as an advisor to decision-making ego. Consider it to be your parent that lets your id and ego know what's appropriate and what's not. So then if you take a little bit, look further down on that diagram, it takes you to the unconscious level of your id. Now, the id part of your personality is the part that is really in touch with your instincts, the primitive sexual and aggressive instincts, your natural survival instincts such as food, water, reproduction, shelter, very impulsive, irrational in some ways because it's so focused on those primal instincts. So that diagram that you can see is based off of Freud's psychoanalytic theory.
So these 3 components of the ego also are components of the personality. So when we take a look at what does personality mean, personality refers to the individual differences and characteristics of patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. There are common definitions to these types, like we hear things like type A, which is like a go-getter, very aggressive, analytical, calendar type, timely driven, and then type B, which might be a little more relaxed, a little more daydreamy. We also hear terms like introvert versus extrovert, where introverts are described as being shy or reserved, and extroverts are described as being the life of the party or wanting to be around large groups. Then there's also things like personality tests, which can help give you a more detailed view of your personality and the different components that make it up. So when we take a look at those different types, there are 2 basic variables that go into all of them. And one of them is, are they better with data? Are they more analytical? Are they more into facts and figures? Or are they into relationships and connections, communication, things of that nature? That can be one thing to help you kind of break it down into just 2 basic categories. And then another is, are they introverted or extroverted? So they may be analytical and be extroverted, or they may be analytical and introverted. And those 2 things might help you navigate how to communicate with them. So knowing your audience will help you shape how you want to deliver your message. So now that we've taken a look at what the difference between ego and personality is. Let's take a look at how this transfers into the workplace. What does it look like in real life? I want to discuss some scenarios of times that I've had to deal with different types of egos. So, having a healthy ego can equate to having a strong sense of self-confidence, a feeling of competence in your skills and your talents, as well as being able to receive constructive criticism. And these are traits that go a long way in making team members feel safe and comfortable working alongside you in the workplace. So sometimes where I've worked along egos or personality types that I felt were pretty easygoing, it was easier for me to communicate with them. I didn't feel as much tension when I was trying to get a point across, and vice versa. The communication was easy. I could understand where they were coming from. But also having an ego that's out of balance can cause folks to be defensive, to be not open to criticism or suggestions, might have them think a little more closed off about their communication. And this can be detrimental to teams, especially when communication is the foundation of your work, right? So when you have to have key information shared back and forth, but team members are closed off, that's not conducive to efficient workflow. So when you have those unhealthy or those unbalanced egos, this can be especially exacerbated at work when people are having what we call an ego trip, right? So when they've just having a really self-inflated view of themselves, and imagine that is happening with a person in a position of authority, that can really start to bring in some different problems, right?
Yeah. And actually, there was a study performed by Carnegie Mellon University that examined how physicians would respond to ego checks, basically queries about their own vulnerability to the conflicts of interest after having their confidence boosted or shaken, okay? So the study found that physicians with high but fragile self-esteem, as measured by their degree of narcissism, would respond to an ego threat by stating greater self-perceived invulnerability to conflicts of interest relative to their peers. This study raised the issue of how in some cases these motivational factors interfered with the soundness of physicians' clinical judgments. So they also put in a paragraph stating a healthy ego is an important part of overall psychological resilience. However, when faced with an ego threat, individuals with high but unstable self-esteem may be more prone to maladaptive behaviors aimed at bolstering or safeguarding their self-image. The medical field, which tends to select individuals who are high in self-confidence, yet exposes them to situations characterized by great uncertainty and high stakes, might be fertile ground for behavior patterns of this type. So it's definitely something that we as healthcare professionals see in our day-to-day routine.
Definitely. And especially that portion where they're talking about maladaptive behaviors.
Yeah.
Because we can all think of a time where we've had to ego check someone or to deal with them when they're in a ego trip.
Yes.
And they get that defensiveness, and sometimes it results in screaming, yelling, throwing things, gossiping, right? Spinning stories. So those behaviors and showing up in the workplace can definitely be have a negative impact on the team and the work at large. So now that we've kind of taken a look at how egos can help us, as they're kind of our shield of how we show up in the world, what we believe about ourselves, where we've grown up, we've seen how they can hurt us when they're out of balance or they're too inflated, or we're behaving negatively. And also how they can protect us, because it's going to be our egos and our personalities that shield us during those times that we have to deal with other people's egos being out of bounds. So let's discuss how we can identify and work with our egos. Examining the ego means examining the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, but at the same time, looking at our self-perception. Sometimes it can, use a little tune-up can be helpful to be self-reflective.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, Rebecca, have there ever been any times where you've had to deal with really self-inflated egos?
Yes, a couple different times. There were certain situations where employees and myself had trouble communicating with each other just because of different personalities. And it got to a point where we ended up taking off the floor and just kind of having a screaming match in an office, just because we didn't know how to talk to each other. And in that screaming match, we kind of brought each other down and basically, okay, so if I need to say or discuss a certain point with you, I need to say it like this. And if you're saying something to me, I need these details to interpret it properly, because everybody interprets things differently, right? So when you realize you have a communication barrier, unfortunately for us, it just got to that boiling level where eventually we just had to go and have a screaming match about it off the floor. But it was overall wasn't my best point in my career, but to be honest, getting it all out in that type of communication helped. We learned a lot from each other in that, and we both settled down. Another situation was a coworker that disagreed with how the education program was running at a certain facility, to which he would discuss with new hires how it should go and shouldn't go, and it was kind of acting like a bit of poison. So we had to take him off the floor and talk to him about, hey, these are our expectations with the education program. This is, if you have concerns, please bring them to us. Like, we want to, again, bringing it back to a team modality here. We want to make sure that we're doing the best we can for the team. Take him out of the equation and refocused it back to the team.
100%. And kudos to you, first and foremost, for outlining that, as a leader, our performance is not always perfect. Sometimes these egos and these personalities get the best of us. But for you and the other person you were dealing with to be able to take it off the floor, escalate the conversation down, and figure out a way to communicate with each other going forward so that this isn't just repeated over and over again. I think that's awesome. Go ahead.
Can you tell us about some of the times you've had to deal with this in the workplace?
Absolutely. One that comes to mind for me is dealing with especially surgeons, right? Because it's very common for us to talk about the fact that we deal with screaming, yelling. But I also think it's important to highlight when we are able to, like you said, take these things off the floor and come to a consensus. And so we had an ortho team that we were working with, and we were having, increasingly hostile communications between the teams. Everybody's frustrated, holes, trade issues, the whole nine. But we set up a meeting, and we all got together, all the attendings and all the SPD leadership, and we talked about where was this hostility coming from? Why does everybody feel so uncomfortable? And I was really taken aback because the surgeon that had asked the question was actually one that had yelled at me prior. And so I'm like, wait, what dream are we in right now? But I was able to be honest with him and say, actually, you've raised your voice at me before, some of your colleagues, and this is how it impacts the team around you, because it also frazzles the nurses and the scrub techs, right? And we're all nervous trying to get back to normal. And so we were able to have honest and authentic communication and resolve those issues. They were able to take a look at their behavior and understand that, like you said, when it comes to the team, that behavior isn't advantageous and really wasn't a reflection of what they wanted. Like, it wasn't getting their point across. It wasn't helping us, navigate what we needed. So I was really honestly shocked that they were able to come to the table like that, because we don't see that often. Sometimes folks stay in that ego trip and just say, well, I've got the title, and so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing.
There's a comment from Dinar that says, how do you differentiate between ego and emotion? And I think that is a specific example. I think that in the moment, your emotions are so heightened that you can't see the situation clearly and analytically. So when you take a step back, you can take yourself and your ego and check it. And you can take what you know of yourself and what you know with your experience and your skill set, but you have the calmness. Your emotions are settled. Your emotions are there. Right. So you can reframe and rediscuss and reconvene.
I think that's great. And I'd also add, when your behavior has shifted quickly, I think it's something that can kind of cue you that you might be more in that id space and more of that instinctual and defensive space.
Yes.
Because typically we wouldn't choose to yell or scream to get our point across. And if all day long your normal MO is not to scream, but now there's a situation that has triggered you into yelling, that could be a clue to you that, okay, I'm moving out of my, my normal operating, and I'm going into heightened emotion now. I'm moving into my ego.
Yes. So then there are a couple of things that when, dealing with challenging and delicate egos is already hard enough. But when you add it to our stressful jobs, it makes it even more difficult, right?
Yes.
And when we tiptoe around these egos, it can lead to high levels of dissatisfaction and disengagement, which are two things you do not want in your sterile processing department. Those can lead to some very serious patient safety risks in the long haul, okay? So the hard part is handling these complex issues before they blow up and cause too much damage within your department. So here are a few ways that you can help navigate your egos without drastic measures, even if the ego that's causing trouble is yours. Okay, so number one, draw your boundaries and stick to them. Make a mental list of things you will tolerate and things you will have issues with. This is going to help you prepare your reactions in the moment. So instead of coming hot out the gate, all emotional and hot-headed, you've put some pre-thought to it and you're ready to stay calm and collected. If you're actively dealing with a challenging ego, it's helpful to take a step back and think about what your boundaries are again. So this doesn't mean being a doormat. It's very important that you do not become a doormat. Decide what your boundaries are when you have a clear head, not in the heat of the moment again, okay? Number two, remember, there's no I in team. This is really important when you're dealing with people that have those heavy and those strong egos. People with larger egos may tend to warp the meaning of the words teamwork. So to some, those definitions end up meaning things like I, me, myself, mine, okay? And that's why it's good to practice and emphasize group efforts rather than individual victories. So congratulating your team as a whole and celebrating the small victories and the successes that your team has as a whole can really help humble an ego. And it's a reminder that everyone's efforts are vital to the success of the department, okay? It's important to create that community with a common purpose. It helps take those egos down a notch or two, okay? You can save the recognition of an individual for a one-on-one conversation. It's a great way to keep the egos in check while maintaining that team mentality, okay? Don't forget, number three, stand up for yourself. Say something when your boundaries are crossed. Sometimes a few polite words can help squash the inflated ego. If you're calling out egotistical behavior and it doesn't cut it, it's time to have a private conversation with the individual. And again, I recommend don't just go into it bullheaded like I did. Take a step, calm down, readdress in a day or two. If you're not in a position to do that, make the people around you in the department who can known about the situation and make them well aware so they can have those discussions with those staff members, okay? Number four, mind your own ego. It can happen to anyone. We all get a little too out of hand, and the problem in our workplace can suddenly become ourselves. So the good news is that if you recognize that you're the issue, that's a huge step. You're already on the path to making things right. The best thing you can do as an employee, leader, manager, or coworker is not taking negative feedback too personally. You have to take it constructively, okay? A common trap that we fall into, especially when we feel underappreciated, is thinking, what would this place do without me? They can't go on without me. Ooh, everything would go wrong if I wasn't here. Yeah, man. If you find yourself, we've all been there when we feel stressed and underappreciated. But if you find yourself getting into that mindset, the best thing you can do is flip it and reverse it. What would happen to this place without everyone else? Okay. Re-emphasizing the team will help you mentally calm it down a notch, but also it will help others in that situation as well. Okay.
I love that. I think all of those tips are great. And we had another question from Denard asking, can authority be mistaken for ego? And I think absolutely authority can be, especially if we're talking about people receiving that. Like if somebody is in an authority position, they might be perceiving that they have an inflated ego simply because they're in a position to tell them what to do. Mm-hmm. I think it's really key to really go back to those steps that Rebecca just listed bring it back to the team atmosphere, and just do some self-evaluation to ask yourself, is it appropriate, the things they're requesting of me? It could help you determine whether or not you're frustrated just simply because you're being told to do something, or if you're frustrated because that ego is really out of order.
Yes.
Awesome. Man, so one of the things that we took a look at was ego work. So again, how do we reflect on ourselves? That the only thing that we truly can control that we bring into this environment, and really make sure that our ego is in check. That the stories that we're telling ourselves are healthy and positive stories, and that we're not, kind of dumping on ourselves a lot of negative thoughts. So, in preparing for the show, I came across this video from Dr. Nicole Lepra. She is a psychologist that does a lot of work around trauma and ego and personality. And so she put together a little video about how to do ego work. So I'm going to pull that up for us now, and we'll watch about 3 minutes of this video. And I'm also going to put the link in the description box so that you guys can click on it at your leisure.
What is ego work then? Ego work is really a practice that takes time, but it's a practice of beginning to observe the ego as separate from the authentic self, to be able to separate who I really am, so the authentic me that contains all the positive things and all the things that I came to believe were a shadow of myself, coming to accept it all and to understand that the ego is there to protect me. So how do we begin? I love the practice of naming the ego, the act of naming it. So my ego's name happens to be Tiffany. So when I sense that Tiffany has been activated in my current life in any way, being able to label it in my mind, oh, there's Tiffany again. She's hurt. She doesn't feel accepted. She's wanting love. Whatever it is that she's nagging about in that moment, giving her a name that's separate from me, it's not Nicole, helps me to understand that, oh, that's just separate from me. That Nicole is actually the person that I can cultivate the opportunity to make a new choice. So once I've named my ego and I can get used to identifying my ego and her responses in my life, I can begin to dive a bit deeper. And I can ask myself, my ego is telling me a story that we really want to explore the story that my ego is telling us. So I'm going to shift away from me and throw out a really global example that I think will resonate with a lot of you, which is a lot of our egos tend to tell us stories that our thoughts, our ideas, our work isn't good enough, right? So once I've dove down and I understand, oh, this is my ego, maybe she's critical in this moment, Tiffany's telling me all of the ways I'm not good enough, I can label that as Tiffany trying to protect me, right? And understand that that's where that's coming from. The story, if I were to believe the story, right, that my thoughts, my ideas, my work isn't good enough, how would I react? A couple ways. I might procrastinate. I might not show up at all. I might compare myself to a million other people. Obviously not comparing myself up, comparing myself down. I'm less than them, further evidence that I'm not good enough or not worthy in that way. Those are not helpful reactions to fulfill us maybe in the ways that we want to be fulfilled. Over time, if I release that story, right, if I can release the story of my thoughts, my ideas, my work not being good enough, I can make space for a new choice. A choice not to procrastinate, a choice to put my truth out into the world, a choice to stop comparing myself endlessly to others, and a choice to allow the authentic me, my light and my dark and everything in between to show up in this world. So before I end, this is a long time process. This does not happen overnight. But the more we come to the understanding of how our ego still functions in our life, because it does, the more we understand that it's protecting us. Our goal isn't to kill it or fight it away. It's not an intrusive thing that's happening to us. It's something that we can learn to work with, to separate from, and to make new choices so that we can show up more authentically in the world. I hope you found this helpful. I did write a blog on all things ego work as well that covers these. So for those of you who like something in the written form, I will link that down below so you can check that out as
well. Awesome. And I'm definitely going to drop that link for you guys.
It's an awesome video. She makes things so understandable. She really breaks it down. Anybody can understand it, and it just resonated really deeply with me.
Absolutely, especially when she talked about the ego stories and the things we repeat to ourselves. And I think about our previous episode on burnout, and that's some of what's happening to you, right? Is that your ego is telling you things like, I'm not worthy, or I don't belong here, or my ideas aren't good enough, right? And that can contribute to just the stress that you're under and make it harder for you to make clear decisions. So being able to do that ego work a little bit at a time, when you're not in a super agitated state, I think can help all of us show up better in the workplace.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
And like she said, it's not something that happens overnight. It can take months, years. It's hard.
It's very, very difficult. And especially when we're, in these environments where there's so many egos, right? So many different personalities to deal with. This, it can be challenging to kind of separate out what's you, what's me, what's the entity with our patients, right? So really taking that time, to privately reflect and kind of get a deeper sense of how you show up in the world.
Yeah. And a lot of the stuff when we were researching this topic, a lot of the sources stated that meditation was a huge way for people to kind of start their ego work. And meditation doesn't work for everybody, but it's what you define it within yourself and what you define as meditation, I should say. It's like we were just talking about this. It's not always the Om. You know what I mean? You don't have to, it's not all about that. Like there's some really awesome breathing techniques.
I found a lot of breath work techniques, deep breathing exercises, but I also found a lot of things described as meditation as anything that kind of pulls you out of your analytical mind. So for some people it was working out, coloring, walking, just anything that kind of settles you and just allows you to observe your thoughts rather than being actively engaged with them. I know for me, that part of meditation used to frustrate me because I got the sense that they wanted you to quiet your mind and clear it. And I'm like, these thoughts are just go.
It's getting worse by me sitting here being quiet.
Going stop. But I found some things for me were journaling, listening to music, walking, drawing. Those things allowed me to slow my thoughts down enough that I'm able to just observe them and not feel so tied into them. If I think about something I haven't done, the next thought isn't, well, let me put it on the calendar. It's just interesting. Yeah, I'm coloring
more. Trying to be in the moment more.
More present.
Right, more present. Absolutely. Easier said than done, but you guys, one step at a time.
One step at a time. This was awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode of Behind the Red Line.
You can find this episode on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. Be sure to like the channel. And if you found this helpful, please share it. You're going to catch us every Monday at 6:30 Eastern right here on all these platforms. All through the Process channels.
Yes, all over the Process Network.
All over.
We will, all over. Because the Process will be at HSPA in the coming week. So our next episode would typically be on the 25th. However, we will be at the conference meeting all of our internet cousins.
I know.
So there may be a little different flavor to the episode, but take a look out for us there. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good one. And we'll see you.
Thank you, everyone.